King Arthur, the podcast. Ask anyone what they know about ancient British history, and nearly everyone will start at 1066, the Norman invasion. Ask anyone about British history before 1066, and nearly everyone will say that the country was overrun by uncivilised barbarians, and that order was only achieved with the occupation of the Romans. Well, what if I told you that everything we know about our history is wrong? Just as we've been lied to over wars, money, banks, secret societies, and the role of our monarchy in society, we too have been lied to about our ancient British history. This podcast is an exercise in putting that right, to shine light on our ancient British history, which since the 17th century has been turned upside down and inside out. But let me first introduce to you two gentlemen without whom this podcast could never have been possible. Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett. Two names that if you haven't heard of already, you will indeed hear about in the next few years. I first heard about them on Richard D. Hall's Rich Planet TV show, in which they were talking about the real King Arthurs, about how history has mistakenly mixed up the two King Arthurs into one, and as a result spoiled and smeared the true stories of the King Arthurs for generations to come. Descended from the royal family, King Arthur I was the son of Magnus Maximus, and directly related to King Arthur II, who himself was son of King Myrig, who was the son of King Theoric. Making sense of ancient British history is easy by reading the historical Cymru records. It's revealed in black and white that our British ancestors first migrated to Britain in 1500 BC, and in another migration in 500 BC, led by King Brutus, of which Britain was originally named after. Published in a wealth of books, from the King Arthur Conspiracy, Moses in the Hieroglyphics, Articus Rex, King Arthur the Walking, and the latest release, the Satanic Protocol, we learn that the Cobran alphabet originated in ancient Assyria and can be traced via Egypt, Palestine, Italy, Switzerland to England, Scotland and Wales. The ancient British history isn't shy in coming forward. The ancient British were one of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. The historical records reveal the exact location of the Ark of the Covenant and tell us that Jesus travelled to England with his family in about 36 to 37 AD, that Christianity originated in England, and that the Romans never conquered Britain. Amazing revelations, you may agree, earth-shattering and history-changing. Listening to the historical research of Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett has changed my life forever. But why isn't this being taught in every school in Great Britain? A logical question to ask. The answer is terrible, criminal and soul-destroying, all rolled into one. Reading from the Satanic Protocol. Since 1714 AD, accurate British history has been obliterated. This clique has ridiculed the provable history of the migration to Britain, led by Albine, from the advanced civilization of Ur around 1500 BC. A prime example is to ignore the famed metalworking culture that erupted in southern Britain at the time, which is called the Wessex culture, where the archaeological evidence proves the history to be correct, and the Sabine establishment historians deny it. The migrations into ancient Britain became a particular target, and these ancient tales of origins were persistently ridiculed. British history that details a migration to Britain from Western Asia Minor, led by Brutus around 500 BC, was declared to be absurd, as the Greeks dated the Trojan War at around 1340 to 1140 BC. In fact, the Romans, the Franks and the Jews all supported the British date for the Trojan War, and the Greeks had never ever presented any real evidence. So, you see, it really does make sense. With any invading force, they would want to smear the achievements of their enemy to ensure the population, under their control, remain compliant and malleable. Make no bones about it. Our great nation was invaded by Normans in 1066, and we've been living under foreign control ever since. After all, as we all know, the Windsor royal family are in fact of German origin. It makes sense that a foreign invading force would denounce their ancient foes as uncivilized barbarians not worthy of mention. And that's exactly what happened with the history of ancient Britain. Since the days of Constantine the Great, grandfather of Magnus Maximus, and the great-grandfather to King Arthur I, the British have been a mighty force respected across the European continent. The Romans never conquered Britain. In fact, Roman nobility travelled and settled into Britain to marry British nobility. King Arthur I fought the Romans all the way to Rome, where he killed the emperor himself and paraded the parader's sword, which he prized from the emperor's dead hands on the way back to Britain. Who would challenge the authority of a man who could do that? Ancient British history is a drama unlike any other that's been told to date. On more than one occasion, the mighty British nation were nearly wiped out. Within a few years of each other, Magnus Maximus, King Arthur I and Constantine the Great were killed in swift succession. The mighty British nation could have fallen then, but their historical might and culture won through, and their royal heritage held sway. With their authority intact, and their armies and fights in order, they maintained their rule and control, onwards to King Fearic, King Myrig, and King Arthur II. King Arthur I fought the Romans, and King Arthur II fought the Saxons. Ancient British history is simply too vast and interesting to summarise in a few bullet points, so we should all be grateful that it's been written down in such detail for future generations to read, enjoy and marvel at. Allow me to read you page 56 from King Arthur the War King. It's a fascinating insight to King Arthur's II's young life and chronicles his first day at school. So here goes. That same day, 6 heavily armed horsemen rode along a mountain valley in North Wales, and with them, riding on a small white pony, was the young King Arthur. 4 servants followed behind on ponies and leading pack horses. The arms and armour of the 6 knights was magnificent, and they rode huge war horses. Everywhere on their helmets, shields, swords and body armour was the gleam of red, gold and silver, inset in blue, red and white enamel. These were the champion warriors and knights of the court of the Glamorgan king, mighty and mature men who carried the scars of 50 battles, famous for their victories and slaughters. These were the hand-picked men, close kinsmen of the king, men who feared nothing. The party moved slowly, pacing its daily travel to what the little boy and the pony could manage. They were working their way up between the steep valleys and mountains, heading for the fortress at Deganwy, where Merlin Emeries dwelt like an eagle roosting on a mountain top. The little group was not big enough to cause any alarm, but yet large enough and splendidly dressed so as to excite the curiosity of the people whose districts they passed through. They had been travelling for over 2 weeks, and now they were almost at their destination. One of the knights drew his horse aside and pointed ahead, and there on the hill in the distance they could make out the high timber stockades on top of the huge earth mounds that ran around the top of the steep hill in the distance. So the party plodded forward, feeling the warm sun on their backs, under the clear blue sky, speckled only with a high mist-like clouds. Finally, they climbed the slopes of the defended hill, heading along the ridge that took them towards the huge wooden gates. When they arrived at the gates, which stood open, a big, fat, stout old man came forward to meet them. A thick belt encircled his huge, sagging belly, and a long sword hung in a plain leather scabbard. He was all of 70 years old, with long white hair, but his arms were like hams, and his fists were the size of small loaves of bread, and his shoulders were those of an ox. He simply stood in the gateway, and it was obvious that no one would pass until he said so. The leading knight stopped. "I am Guerrilla, son of the Guerrilla, and we are on the business of King Fearic of South Wales, and this is Arthur, the son of King Merrick and the son of King Furic. The old man was squinting at them, shading the sun from his eyes with his hands. I am Moro, battle leader, gatekeeper to the Prince Merlin Emeries, said the old man, and he stepped aside and waved them forward into the large open courtyard of the fortress at the top of the hill. The men on horseback looked at the old gatekeeper with interest, for here was a living legend of the past standing before their eyes. The bards and poets sung of the mighty deeds of Moro the Black. They rode into the courtyard, and 2 grooms came from the stables to meet them and to take their horses. There was a notable absence of men, people, in so large a fortress. The 6 knights dismounted, and Arthur slid down from the back of the pony and dusted his clothes down with his tiny hands. Then he walked over and stood, looking up at the enormous mountain of flesh that was the great Moro. They sing of you in the songs, and they call you Moro the Black, but your hair is all white. Arthur stood looking up at Moro curiously. His voice was high-pitched, childlike but firm. Moro looked down and laughed, his several chins wobbling and his great belly quaking and shaking. That was when I was young. My hair was once dark like yours, as black as a raven, but now I'm old and it is white. Ah, said the child, perhaps you should have kept fighting, then it would not have gone white. Moro stared at young Arthur in disbelief, and then he realised that the little boy would have loved to have seen him in all his power and glory with his long black hair. No one lives forever, my friend, said Moro kindly. And when a man gets a little older, he tires more easily, just like an old horse. So he either stops fighting or he dies fighting, Moro finished. Arthur looked silently at Moro, taking the huge bulk of the man, and then he said quite defiantly, I think I'll go on fighting until I win, and then there is no more fighting to be done by anyone. Perhaps you will, perhaps you will. Moro turned and motioned for the group to follow him to the hall where the Prince Merlin Emeries would be waiting for them. So the little party of brilliantly armed knights, led by the tiny Arthur, followed after Moro as he lumbered across the dusty yard. Isn't that just wonderful? That really gives you a taste of the genius of Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett by converting what they've learned from the historical records into a narrative in which we can all understand. But be under no illusions. Even today the anti-King Arthur propaganda continues. Take for example the British-born movie director Guy Ritchie, who's been tasked with keeping the lie going. Our foreign overseers are loath to admit that the ancient British kings rivaled the emperors of Rome. They are loath to admit Christianity started in Britain and not Rome. They are loath to admit King Arthur was a real historical figure, let alone there being 2 of them. The King Arthur revival movement is spreading far and wide across Europe. During the Queen's most recent visit to her homeland in Germany in 2015, street graffiti spelt out who the real monarchy was. Guy Ritchie's King Arthur movies have been postponed for a year because more and more people are waking up to the truth. The truth is King Arthur was born on Christmas Day, 503 AD. The truth is that he was born into a long line of British kings descended from the Holy Family itself. The truth is that King Arthur I fought the Romans, and King Arthur II fought the Saxons. The truth is that everything we know about our history is wrong, based on lies and deception. How did the King Arthur kingdom end? This is another story in itself. Asteroid debris destroyed the Arthurian kingdom in 562 AD, heralding in the Dark Ages, in which nothing grew in Britain for about 7 to 11 years. King Arthur's brother, Prince Madoc, was at sea when the disaster struck, and was washed out across the ocean where he miraculously discovered America. You simply cannot make the story up. Having brought back a native Indian as proof, King Arthur II sent one of his admirals across the endless ocean to confirm what his brother had claimed. Once he was convinced there was a new land, without any kings laying claim to it, he himself sailed with 700 ships across the Atlantic and made his base in Kentucky. Now, stubborn as any medieval king would be, he caused problems with the native Red Indians by refusing them entry across their own lands. History tells us that on one particular ferocious battle, a young native savage snuck through the defences and plunged a spear into King Arthur II's heart as he rested, having taken off his heavy armour. History cannot lie. You can still pick up the arrowheads from the field on which the ancient Welsh fought the ancient Red Indians. You can still visit the cave in which King Arthur's dry, mummified body was stored before being laid to rest in the grounds of the world's oldest Christian church called St. Peter's in Wales. History cannot lie. A fact which makes the King Arthur story so fascinating and amazing. We all know about the legendary prophecy that says King Arthur will return in our nation's darkest hour. It would seem the prophecy is coming true. The nation's darkest hour is now. The memory of King Arthur's are being rediscovered, and in the process, both King Arthur I and King Arthur II are being proved to be real.